My name is Megan, I'm 31, and 8 months ago I found out my husband had been having an affair with my own sister for almost 2 years. I found out by accident, the way these things usually happen in the stories you hear. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower, a notification banner from a messaging app one didn't even know he used. I wasn't snooping. I genuinely wasn't the type. But the preview text on the screen said something that made my stomach drop before I even fully understood why, something affectionate, something that used a nickname I'd never heard him use for me. I picked up the phone. I know I shouldn't have, that it violated some unwritten rule of trust between married people, but by that point trust had already been broken somewhere else entirely. I just didn't know it yet. The messages went back almost 2 years. Photos. Plans to meet. My sister's name at the top of the thread, the contact saved simply as K. Kayla. My younger sister, 28, the one who used to sleep over at our apartment when she was between leases, the one who was supposed to be my maid of honor before a scheduling conflict pulled her away 3 weeks before the wedding, a conflict I now understood. With sickening clarity, probably hadn't been a scheduling conflict at all. I sat on the bathroom floor outside the shower for 11 minutes, according to the phone's lock screen clock, just holding his phone, reading, rereading, feeling something inside me quietly and permanently rearrange itself. When he stepped out, wrapped in a towel, and saw my face, he didn't even ask what was wrong right away. He just went very still, the particular stillness of someone who already knows exactly what's happening and is deciding, in real time, how much to lie. He didn't deny it, which I've thought about a lot since. Some part of me almost respected that in the moment, before I understood the full shape of what I was dealing with. He sat down on the edge of the bathtub, still dripping, and told me everything, or at least a version of everything, in a flat, exhausted voice like a man finally setting down something heavy he'd been carrying too long. It had started at my cousin's wedding, almost 2 years earlier, a night I actually remembered clearly because I'd gotten food poisoning from the shrimp and spent most of the reception in the hotel room while everyone else danced. Apparently my husband and my sister had ended up talking for hours by the hotel bar that night, something shifting between them that neither of them acted on immediately, but that neither of them forgot either. It became physical about 4 months later, he said, at a family barbecue where I'd left early for a work emergency. From there it had continued, carefully, secretly, for almost 2 years, hidden inside a marriage and a family that had no reason to suspect anything, because who suspects their own sister? I asked him the question that felt most urgent in that moment, more urgent even than the betrayal itself. I asked if he loved her. He hesitated just long enough for the hesitation itself to answer the question before he even said the word yes. I don't remember much of what happened immediately after that. I know I left the house. I know I drove to a hotel 40 minutes away and sat in the parking lot for almost 2 hours before I could make myself walk inside. I know I didn't sleep that night or the next one, and that somewhere around 3 in the morning on the second night, I finally called my mother, because I didn't know who else to call. And because some childish part of me still believed she'd know how to make this feel survivable. My mother's first response, when I finally got the words out through the crying, wasn't the response I expected. There was a long silence on the line, longer than made sense for someone hearing devastating news for the first time. When she finally spoke, she said, quietly, "How long have you known?" That question told me everything. She already knew, or suspected, or had been told, at some point, by someone and had chosen not to say anything to me. I asked her directly, my voice shaking in a way I barely recognized, whether she'd known about Kayla and my husband before this moment. She didn't answer right away, which was its own kind of answer, and then she admitted that Kayla had told her about it 3 months earlier, in tears, saying she was in love with him and didn't know what to do, and that our mother had told her to end it quietly, to let it fade, to never let it become something that would hurt me. My mother had known for 3 months. She'd sat across from me at Sunday dinners, at my birthday, at a movie night just 2 weeks earlier, carrying that knowledge silently, choosing, apparently, to protect the fragile piece of the family over telling me the truth about my own marriage. I hung up on her. I don't think I'd ever hung up on my mother before in my entire life, not once, not even as an angry teenager. But something in me simply couldn't stay on that call another second, couldn't listen to another word of justification for why staying silent had seemed like the right choice to the people who were supposed to protect me most. My father, when I finally reached him separately, was equally complicated. He hadn't known the details, he insisted, but he'd sensed something was off between Kayla and my husband for months and had chosen not to look too closely, some part of him not wanting to know. Not wanting to be the one who had to say something and blow up the family over a suspicion he couldn't prove. An entire family, apparently, had been circling this secret for months, each of them choosing silence for their own reasons, while I remained the only one who didn't know the actual shape of my own life. I didn't speak to Kayla directly for almost 3 weeks after everything came out. I couldn't. Every time I imagined the conversation, something in my chest closed up so completely I couldn't breathe properly. She finally showed up at my apartment, the temporary one I'd rented after leaving the house, uninvited, standing outside my door for almost 20 minutes according to my doorbell camera before she finally knocked. I almost didn't let her in. Part of me wanted to leave her standing there indefinitely, the way she'd apparently left me standing outside the truth of my own marriage for 2 years. I let her in anyway. I don't fully know why, except that some old habit of being her older sister, the one who used to let her stay over during hard times, the one who used to fix things, refused to fully die even now. She cried almost immediately, sitting on my unfamiliar new couch in an unfamiliar new apartment, saying she was sorry, that she never meant for it to happen, that she'd fought it for a long time before finally giving in. I asked her the same question I'd asked my husband. Did she love him? She said yes, immediately, without the hesitation he'd shown, which somehow hurt more, the certainty of it, as if this had never been a mistake to her at all, just an inevitability she'd finally stopped resisting. I asked her how she could do this, specifically to me, her own sister, the person who used to drive 2 hours to help her move apartments, who'd lent her money more times than either of us could count, who'd been the one constant, reliable presence through every unstable chapter of her 20s. She said, through tears, that she'd tried to stay away, that she'd told our mother she wanted to end it, but that whatever was between her and my husband had felt bigger than either of their ability to stop it. I told her that bigger than our ability to stop it was just a softer way of saying she'd chosen him, repeatedly, over an entire relationship with me. Over 2 years of Sunday dinners and birthday parties where she looked me in the eye while carrying this secret the entire time. She didn't have an answer for that. She just cried harder, and eventually I asked her to leave, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely didn't know what else there was left to say that wouldn't just be the same wound, reopened, over and over, without ever actually closing. The divorce process took almost 5 months, longer than either of us expected, mostly because there was a house involved, one we'd bought together 3 years earlier, and a level of shared finances that took time to properly untangle. My husband, I should say his name at this point, David, tried several times during those months to explain himself further, to contextualize the affair as something that had happened to him rather than something he'd actively chosen, again and again, for 2 years. He used phrases like, "We didn't mean for it to happen," and "sometimes things just happen between people," language that made the whole thing sound like weather, like something neither of them had any control over, rather than a series of specific choices made specifically to deceive me. I stopped engaging with those explanations somewhere around month 3. There was nothing left to understand. The facts were simple enough on their own. He'd chosen her repeatedly in specific moments while maintaining a marriage with me that had apparently become, at some point I never noticed, a kind of performance rather than a reality. The house sale finalized in the 5th month. We split the proceeds according to what our lawyers worked out, and I moved into a smaller apartment across town, one with no shared history, no furniture we'd picked out together, nothing that could ambush me with memory in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday evening. David and Kayla, I later learned through my mother, who was cautiously trying to rebuild some kind of communication with me by that point, had moved in together almost immediately after the divorce finalized. I don't know if that information was meant to hurt me or simply meant as an update delivered without much thought about how it would land. Either way, it landed exactly as hard as you'd expect. The wider family split, roughly, into two camps, though the divide wasn't always clean or predictable. My aunt, my mother's sister, stopped speaking to Kayla almost entirely, calling what she'd done unforgivable, a betrayal not just of me but of the basic fabric of what family was supposed to mean. My grandmother, in her 80s by that point, simply stopped mentioning Kayla's name at all, a silence more devastating in its own way than any direct confrontation could have been. My father tried to stay neutral for longer than made sense to me, still having dinner occasionally with Kayla, still texting her on her birthday, a kind of careful diplomacy that felt, from where I stood, like a quiet betrayal of its own. I asked him once, directly, how he could maintain any relationship with her after what she'd done. He said, uncomfortably, that she was still his daughter, that loving her didn't mean condoning what she'd done, that he was trying to hold space for both truths at once. I told him I understood the sentiment in theory, but that in practice, watching him maintain easy warmth with the person who'd broken my marriage felt like being told, indirectly, that my pain had an expiration date he expected me to respect. My mother's situation was the most complicated of all, at least from my perspective. She'd known for 3 months before I did. That fact sat between us like a wall neither of us fully knew how to address directly. She tried, several times over those months, to explain her silence, saying she'd been trying to protect me, that she'd hoped the affair would end quietly on its own before it ever had to become something I needed to know about. I told her that trying to protect me by keeping me in the dark about my own marriage wasn't protection at all. It was just choosing Kayla's comfort and the family's fragile peace over my right to know the truth about my own life. She didn't have a good answer for that either. Most people, I was learning, didn't have good answers when finally confronted directly with choices they'd made out of fear rather than genuine thought. Somewhere around the 7th month after finding that phone on the kitchen counter, I started seeing a therapist, something I'd resisted for years out of a stubborn, misplaced belief that I should be able to handle my own problems without outside help. Therapy taught me things about myself I hadn't fully examined before. I learned that I'd spent most of my adult life in the role of the reliable one, the fixer, the sister who showed up, the daughter who didn't cause problems, and that this role, while genuinely rooted in love, had also quietly trained the people around me to assume my feelings were less urgent than everyone else's, less likely to shatter, less in need of protection. My mother's 3 months of silence made a certain terrible sense through that lens. She'd trusted, on some unconscious level, that I could absorb almost anything without breaking, that my particular strength as the reliable daughter meant I didn't need to be told hard truths as urgently as someone more fragile might. It wasn't malicious, exactly. But it was a kind of quiet disrespect dressed up as protection, the assumption that my resilience meant my pain mattered less. I started, slowly, to unlearn some of that role during those months. I said no to things I would have automatically said yes to a year earlier. I let myself be visibly upset in front of people instead of performing composure the way I always had. I stopped being the one who smoothed over every family conflict, the one who called everyone individually after arguments to broker peace nobody else was willing to broker themselves. It was uncomfortable, at first, watching the family dynamic shift as I stopped playing my old role. Some relationships got harder, more honest, more able to hold real weight instead of just performed harmony. Others simply faded, unable to survive without me quietly managing them from the background the way I always had. About 9 months after everything came out, I received a long letter from Kayla, handwritten, mailed to my new apartment even though I hadn't given her the address, meaning she'd gotten it from our mother, another small betrayal layered on top of the larger one. The letter was long, 4 pages, and I read it twice before deciding how I felt about it. She wrote about how the affair had started, more detail than David had ever given me, about the specific night at my cousin's wedding, about how she'd tried, genuinely tried, for months afterward to avoid him, to bury whatever had started that night, before eventually giving in. She wrote about guilt, real guilt it seemed, describing nights she couldn't sleep, family dinners where she could barely look at me, the particular horror of watching me plan things, ordinary things, a vacation, a home renovation, while carrying the knowledge of what she was doing behind my back the entire time. She wrote that she wasn't asking for forgiveness, that she understood if I never spoke to her again, that she simply needed me to know she understood exactly how much damage she'd caused, that she thought about it every day. That some nights the guilt felt almost unbearable. I didn't respond to the letter for almost a month. When I finally did, I kept it short. I wrote that I appreciated her honesty, that I believed her guilt was real, but that understanding her guilt didn't obligate me to offer comfort for it. I told her that some choices have consequences that simply can't be undone by explanation, no matter how sincere, and that our relationship, at least for the foreseeable future, was one of those consequences. I didn't hear back from her after that. I don't know if my response hurt her, or if she'd expected it, or if she'd simply moved further into her new life with David, one where I existed increasingly as a distant, complicated absence rather than an active presence demanding reckoning. The first Thanksgiving after everything happened was the hardest single day of the entire ordeal, harder even than the day I found the phone, because it forced the abstract fact of the family's fracture into a specific, physical, unavoidable reality. My mother hosted, as she always had, and the question of who would attend became a quiet crisis weeks in advance, handled through careful, anxious phone calls I mostly avoided being part of. Eventually it was decided, without much input from me, that Kayla and David would attend Thanksgiving dinner, and that I would be invited to a separate gathering the following weekend instead, a kind of quiet triage nobody called by its real name. I understood the logistics of it. I even understood, on some level, that my mother was trying to avoid forcing an impossible confrontation at a holiday table. But the practical effect was that my sister and my ex-husband got the actual holiday, the real one, the one with the specific date and the specific meaning, while I got a consolation gathering scheduled around everyone else's convenience. I spent that actual Thanksgiving alone, by choice, having declined an invitation to a friend's family gathering because I genuinely wanted the solitude, needed it. To sit with everything the day represented without performing gratitude I didn't fully feel yet. I ordered Thai food instead of turkey. I watched 3 movies I'd already seen before, comfort choices requiring no emotional investment. I cried twice, quietly, without any specific trigger beyond the ordinary weight of the day itself. The following weekend's gathering felt strange, smaller, missing people, a shadow version of what Thanksgiving used to mean before any of this happened. I appreciated the effort. But I also understood, sitting at that smaller table, that this was probably going to be the shape of holidays for the foreseeable future, a family permanently divided into separate observances, never quite whole in the same room again. It's been just over a year now since I found that phone on the kitchen counter. I live in a new apartment I actually like, decorated entirely according to my own taste, no compromises, no shared history embedded in the furniture. I started painting again, something I'd stopped doing years earlier without fully noticing when or why, and I sold my first piece 3 months ago to a coworker who saw it hanging in my office and asked if it was for sale. David and Kayla got engaged 2 months ago. I found out through a mutual friend before my mother even told me, which felt, in a strange way, less devastating than I would have predicted a year earlier. I think I'd simply run out of capacity to be freshly wounded by updates about their relationship. At some point, grief like that either consumes you indefinitely or it starts, slowly, to become just information, sad information, but survivable information, no longer capable of knocking the wind out of you the way it once did. My relationship with my mother is better than it was, though not fully what it used to be. We talk regularly now, but there's a carefulness to it that wasn't there before, an awareness on both sides that trust, once broken by 3 months of silence about something this significant, takes a long time to rebuild, if it rebuilds fully at all. My relationship with my father remains complicated. He still maintains some contact with Kayla, still attends occasional dinners with her and David, and I've made peace, mostly, with the fact that I can't control his choices about who he stays close to. Only my own choices about how much of that dynamic I'm willing to witness up close. I haven't spoken to Kayla since my response to her letter, almost a year ago now. I don't know if that will change eventually. Some days I think it might, in some distant future where enough time has passed that the wound feels more like a scar than an open injury. Other days I think some relationships simply don't survive certain choices, not because forgiveness is impossible in theory, but because trust, once destroyed that completely, that intimately, sometimes just doesn't grow back in any meaningful way, no matter how much time passes. If someone came to me today, sitting where I was sitting a year ago, having just discovered a betrayal this specific, this intimate, involving someone they trusted as completely as I trusted my own sister, I think there are a few things I'd want them to know. I'd tell them that the shock never fully goes away on the timeline you expect it to. I thought, in those first weeks, that I'd feel better within a month or two, that grief this sharp surely couldn't sustain itself indefinitely. It took much longer than that, and even now, over a year later, certain triggers, certain songs, certain dates, still bring some of it rushing back with surprising force. I'd tell them that the people around you will often disappoint you in the immediate aftermath, not always through malice, but through fear, through misplaced attempts at protecting fragile peace, through their own complicated relationships to the people who hurt you. My mother's 3 months of silence taught me that even people who genuinely love you can make choices, under pressure, that prioritize comfort over honesty, and that understanding their reasoning doesn't obligate you to excuse the impact. I'd tell them that anger is not something to rush through on the way to some idealized version of peaceful forgiveness. I spent months feeling guilty for still being angry, as if healthy grief required arriving at forgiveness on some predetermined schedule. Therapy eventually taught me that anger, fully felt, fully expressed rather than suppressed, is often a necessary bridge rather than an obstacle on the way to whatever eventual peace becomes possible. I'd tell them that some relationships, even ones you assumed were unbreakable, might not survive this kind of betrayal, and that this is not a personal failing on your part. Not every fracture is meant to heal completely. Some relationships, after certain choices, simply become different, smaller, more distant, permanently changed rather than fully repaired, and learning to accept that reality, rather than endlessly chasing some impossible full restoration, is its own difficult, necessary kind of growth. And I'd tell them that you survive it. Not quickly, not gracefully most days, but you survive it, and eventually, months or years down the line, you find yourself painting again, or laughing genuinely at something small, or building a life that belongs entirely to you, unhaunted by the specific shape of what you lost. It doesn't erase what happened, but it proves, slowly, undeniably, that what happened doesn't have to be the only thing that defines everything that comes after it. I don't know how the story ends, not really, because I'm still living inside it, still building whatever comes next one ordinary day at a time. David and Kayla will get married eventually, probably within the next year, and I'll have to decide, when that day comes, how to hold that reality, from whatever distance feels survivable. My mother and I are still finding our way back to something resembling real trust, slowly, carefully, neither of us entirely sure yet what the final shape of that relationship will become. My father remains a complicated presence, caught between two daughters he loves in ways that don't fit neatly together anymore. And Kayla exists now mostly as an absence in my life, a sister-shaped space I've had to learn to live around rather than through, some days easier than others, some anniversaries harder than ordinary Tuesdays. What I know, a year out from the worst discovery of my life, is that I'm no longer the person who sat on that bathroom floor for 11 minutes, quietly rearranging around a betrayal I never saw coming. That person had to learn, the hard way, that being reliable doesn't mean being invisible, that love doesn't obligate you to indefinite silence about your own pain, and that sometimes the family you're born into disappoints you in ways too significant to simply absorb and move past without real, lasting change. I'm still turning the page, slower than I'd like most days, but turning it nonetheless. And for the first time in a long time, the story on the next page belongs entirely to me. I haven't talked much yet about my best friend Priya, mostly because for the first few months after everything happened, I was too consumed by the family collapse to properly notice who was actually showing up for me. Looking back now, a year later, I realized she was one of the few constants that never wavered, not once, through any of it. She'd known David for almost as long as I had been at our wedding, had genuinely liked him before all of this. When I told her what happened, sitting across from her at the same diner we'd been going to since college, she didn't ask me a single question about the details before saying, immediately, "What do you need right now, today, this hour?" Not analysis. Not questions about how it happened or how long it had been going on. Just an immediate, practical offer of presence. She was the one who helped me find the apartment I eventually moved into, spending an entire weekend driving me between listings, sitting with me afterward while I cried in her car in 3 different parking lots. She was the one who sat with me during the worst of the paperwork with lawyers, holding my hand under the table during meetings I could barely focus through. She never once said a bad word about David or Kayla directly to me, not because she didn't have opinions, but because she seemed to understand, instinctively, that what I needed most wasn't validation of my anger, but simple, steady companionship through the wreckage. About 6 months in, I finally asked her, during one particularly low night, how she managed to stay so consistently present without ever seeming exhausted by it. She said something I still think about regularly. She said, "You've spent your whole life being the person who shows up for everyone else. I'm not going to be one more person who lets you carry this alone just because you're usually the strong one." It was such a simple statement, but it landed with unexpected weight, partly because it was the exact opposite of what my own family had done, choosing silence and careful diplomacy over the kind of unwavering presence Priya offered without hesitation. I think about, sometimes, how differently this whole year might have felt without her. Family, I learned, isn't always the people who share your blood. Sometimes it's the person who sits with you in parking lots, who doesn't ask unnecessary questions, who simply decides, without being asked, that you're not going to go through the worst year of your life without at least one person standing firmly, unconditionally, beside you. There's a conversation I had with David about 4 months into the divorce process, one of the last real conversations we had before everything became purely transactional, handled through lawyers and brief, necessary logistics. He asked me, somewhat defensively, why I couldn't just accept that sometimes people fall in love unexpectedly, that he hadn't set out to hurt me, that the timing of everything had simply been outside anyone's control. I remember staring at him for a long moment before I found the words to respond. I told him that falling in love unexpectedly wasn't the part one couldn't forgive. People's hearts do complicated, inconvenient things sometimes, and I could imagine a version of this story where I might have eventually found my way to understanding, even forgiveness, for an affair that had been acknowledged quickly, honestly. The moment feelings became undeniable. What I couldn't forgive, I told him, was the 2 years of careful, deliberate concealment. The specific lies. The times he'd told me he was working late when he was actually with my sister. The anniversary dinner, 8 months into the affair, where he'd toasted to our future together while already living an entire secret parallel life. Falling in love unexpectedly is a human failing. Constructing an elaborate, sustained deception around it for 2 years is a choice, made and remade, deliberately, hundreds of times. Every single day he chose not to tell me the truth. He didn't have a response to that. I don't think he'd ever fully separated those two things in his own mind, the falling in love and the deceiving, treating them as a single unified event rather than 2 distinctly different moral failures layered on top of each other. Maybe that's part of what made it possible for him to do what he did for so long, some internal narrative where the deception was simply an unfortunate side effect of the love, rather than its own separate, sustained betrayal requiring its own separate reckoning. I don't know if he's had that reckoning since, whether building a life with Kayla now involves him confronting what those 2 years actually cost the people around him, or whether he's simply moved forward, carrying a version of the story that lets him sleep at night. I've stopped needing to know the answer to that question. It's no longer mine to carry. About 10 months after everything happened, my aunt, the one who'd stopped speaking to Kayla almost immediately, invited me to a small gathering at her house, just her, my grandmother, myself, and a few cousins who'd remained quietly, consistently supportive throughout the entire ordeal without ever making a show of taking sides. Sitting in her living room that evening, eating a meal that had nothing to do with any official holiday, Just an ordinary Tuesday gathering born out of genuine care rather than obligation. I felt something I hadn't felt in almost a year. A sense that family, real family, the kind actually built on showing up rather than just shared blood, still existed for me, even after everything. My grandmother, 83 years old, held my hand for a long moment during that dinner and said something I've carried with me since. She said, "Some families fracture and never come back together. Others fracture and grow a new shape entirely, one that includes different people standing in different places than you expected. Both are still family. They're just different families than the ones you started with." I think about that phrase often now, a new shape entirely. My family, the one I have now, a year later, doesn't look the way it did before that phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It's smaller in some ways, missing people who used to occupy central places in it. But it's also, unexpectedly, more honest, built on people who've proven, through actual consistent action rather than obligation, that they're willing to stand fully beside me rather than performing careful diplomatic neutrality. My aunt has become someone I talk to almost weekly now, something that wasn't true before any of this happened. Priya has become, functionally, closer to a sister than Kayla remains, a relationship built entirely on the kind of unwavering presence that blood relation apparently doesn't guarantee on its own. Even my relationship with my grandmother has deepened, unexpectedly, in the wake of everything, both of us finding, in the wreckage, a closeness that ordinary family gatherings had never quite made room for before. I don't know if this new shape is permanent, or if it will keep shifting as more time passes, as David and Kayla's wedding eventually happens, as my mother and I continue slowly rebuilding whatever trust can still exist between us. But sitting in my aunt's living room that evening, surrounded by people who'd simply, consistently shown up without needing to be asked, I understood something important. Family isn't just the people you're given. Sometimes it's also the people who prove, through their actions during your worst year, that they're choosing to stay. 11 months after everything happened, an envelope arrived in my mailbox with handwriting I recognized immediately as Kayla's, the specific slant she'd had since childhood, unchanged despite everything else that had shifted between us. Inside was a save-the-date card, cream-colored, elegant, announcing that she and David would be married the following spring. I sat with that card at my kitchen table for a long time before deciding how I felt about it. Some part of me had known this was coming, had braced for it in the abstract for months, but there's a particular kind of impact that comes from holding physical proof in your hands, seeing their names printed together in formal calligraphy. A permanence to it that felt different from simply knowing, intellectually, that the wedding was inevitable. There was no formal invitation enclosed, just the save the date, which I understood as its own kind of message, an acknowledgement that they knew this needed careful handling, that they weren't presuming my attendance, that some decision about actual invitations would come later, gently, after they'd had time to gauge how I might react to even this much contact. I called my mother that evening, not in anger this time, just needing to process the strange, complicated grief of holding that card in my hands. She was quiet on the phone for a while before saying, carefully, that she didn't know if she'd attend either, that she was still working out her own complicated feelings about celebrating a marriage built on top of so much damage to another daughter. I told her she didn't need to make that decision on my behalf, that whatever she chose to do about the wedding was hers to navigate separately from my own feelings about it. It was strange, realizing during that conversation how much healthier our relationship had become over the past year, both of us finally able to hold separate, sometimes conflicting feelings without either of us needing the other to validate our specific choice. I still don't know if I'll attend that wedding when the actual invitation eventually arrives. Some days I think I might, purely out of some stubborn desire to prove to myself that I've healed enough to witness it without shattering. Other days I think attending would be its own kind of self-betrayal, forcing myself through something genuinely painful in service of an idea of grace I don't actually owe anyone, least of all the two people who spent 2 years deceiving me. I've decided, for now, not to decide. The wedding is still months away. I've learned, over this past year, that not every question needs an immediate answer, that sometimes the healthiest thing is simply to let a decision remain open until you actually have the clarity to make it honestly, rather than forcing resolution before you're actually ready. Want to end this story by talking about who I've become over this past year, not because I think my personal growth is the most interesting part of any of this, but because I think it's the part most worth sharing with anyone going through something similar right now. I'm more direct now than I used to be, in ways that have surprised even me. I no longer soften bad news to protect other people's comfort. I no longer assume my feelings are less urgent simply because I've historically been the reliable one, the one who could handle things. I say no more often, to people and obligations that don't serve me, without the elaborate guilt spirals that used to accompany every boundary I tried to set. I've also become, unexpectedly, more compassionate in certain specific ways, even toward people who hurt me. Not compassionate in the sense of excusing what happened, but compassionate in the sense of understanding, more fully than I used to, how ordinary, flawed people can make catastrophic choices out of fear, weakness, or desire, without those choices necessarily making them irredeemable monsters. David and Kayla did something genuinely unforgivable to me, but I've stopped needing to see them as purely evil in order to justify my own pain. They're just deeply flawed people who made a choice, repeatedly, that caused enormous damage. Both things can be true at once. I paint almost every week now, something that had disappeared from my life for years before all of this happened, buried under the accumulated busyness of being the reliable one, the fixer, the person who didn't have time for things that were just for herself. I sold 4 more pieces since that first sale to my coworker, small amounts of money that matter less for the income than for what they represent. A part of myself I'd nearly lost that slowly, steadily coming back to life. I've started dating again too, cautiously, nothing serious yet, but enough to remind myself that trust, while harder to extend now, isn't gone entirely, just more carefully guarded than it used to be. I don't know where that will lead. I'm not in a hurry to find out. What I know, sitting here writing this a year and a month after finding that phone on the kitchen counter, is that the person who sat frozen on that bathroom floor for 11 minutes couldn't have imagined the person I've become since. She thought her life had simply ended in that moment, that everything meaningful had been permanently taken from her in one devastating discovery. She didn't yet know that grief, however catastrophic, isn't actually the end of the story. It's just an unbearably difficult chapter, one that eventually, slowly, unevenly, gives way to the next one, and the one after that, each new chapter shaped by loss, but no longer entirely defined by it. If you've read this far, thank you for sitting with all of it, the ugly parts especially. I've told this story now several times, to therapists, to close friends, to my journal on nights I couldn't sleep, and each time I tell it, I notice something slightly different, some detail I'd forgotten, some feeling I'd buried that surfaces again in the retelling. I don't know exactly how the story ends, because I'm still living inside it, still building whatever comes next one ordinary day at a time. The wedding will happen, eventually, with or without me in attendance. My family will keep reshaping itself, slowly, into whatever new configuration eventually feels stable. And I'll keep painting, keep showing up for the people who've proven they'll show up for me in return, keep learning, gradually, what it means to build a life that belongs entirely to myself rather than one defined by everyone else's needs and everyone else's secrets. That's the whole story, as honestly as I know how to tell it. Not a clean lesson about forgiveness, not a tidy moral about resilience, always winning in the end. Just one woman, one devastating discovery, and a long, difficult year of learning that even the worst betrayal imaginable doesn't have to be the final chapter of your entire life, even when, for a long time, it feels like it might be.